When a Christian monk saw the 7-year-old grandson of Abd al-Muttalib, he began to tremble. "It is him," whispered Ascaf, cross-referencing ancient prophecies. The old chieftain of Mecca showed no surprise. He had already suspected the great destiny of his grandson Muhammad. May Allah bless him and grant him peace. That's why he allowed the boy to violate prohibitions that his 10 grown sons obeyed. People from the Banu Mudlij tribe looked at the child's footprint and recoiled in shock. It matched the impression of Prophet Ibrahim on the sacred stone. Abd al-Muttalib simply nodded. He already knew. Today you will learn the story of a man who recognized a prophet in an orphaned infant, renounced false gods for his grandson, and died 8 years before Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, received his first revelation. The story of miracles that occurred in a poor uncle's house, where a single cup of milk fed 8 children, and why all of Mecca wept for 7 days when the old chieftain was lowered into his grave. Chapter 1. The bed no one dared sit upon. In the shade of the sacred Kaaba, where the scorching sand of Mecca burned the bare feet of pilgrims and the air trembled with heat, an old man spread his bed. Abd al-Muttalib, head of the Hashim clan, a man whose word was law for the entire Quraysh tribe, prepared for his afternoon rest. His 10 grown sons stood nearby, not daring to approach. None of them had ever dared even touch this bed. Such was the tradition of respect for a father in a house where honor was valued above gold. But then something strange would happen, something that made passers-by stop and whisper among themselves. A small boy of about 6, a fragile orphan with eyes the color of dark honey, would calmly approach the bed and sit on it, just like that, without fear, without hesitation. Abd al-Muttalib's sons would jump up, ready to grab the audacious child and drag him away. Their faces would flush red with indignation. How dare this boy violate the sacred prohibition that they themselves had observed all their lives? But the old man's hand would stop them with a gesture that could not be disobeyed. "Leave my son alone," Abd al-Muttalib would say, and his voice sounded as though he were pronouncing a prophecy. Then the old man would sit down next to the boy, his gnarled fingers, scarred from countless deals and battles, gently stroking the child's back. "Truly, something great awaits this boy of mine," he would whisper, and in his eyes danced the reflections of secret knowledge. This child was named Muhammad. May Allah bless him and grant him peace. He was only 6 years old when his mother Amina died. His father had perished before his birth. Twice orphaned, a boy without protection in the cruel world of the desert, where the weak were not spared. And yet the old chieftain treated him not as a burden, not as an obligation to his deceased son, but as the greatest treasure that had fallen to his lot. When food was brought, Abd al-Muttalib would seat his grandson beside him, or sometimes place him on his lap, and give him the best portions. Sometimes the dish would grow cold on the table while servants went to fetch the boy. "Bring me my son," the old man would demand, and only when Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, appeared in the doorway would the meal begin. This was a strange sight for Mecca, a city of merchants and warriors where sentimentality was considered weakness. But those who saw how the 90-year-old chieftain kissed the head of his orphan grandson felt that something more was happening than simple attachment of an old man to a child, something that had yet to reveal itself to the world. Chapter 2. The Monk Who Saw Too Much. One sweltering day, when the sun turned the black stone of the Kaaba into molten iron, a stranger sat down next to Abd al-Muttalib, a man from the north, from Najran, a Christian monk named Ascaf. His robes were soaked with the dust of a long journey, but his eyes burned with the feverish gleam of a seeker of truth. He spoke of ancient books, of scrolls that had been kept in monasteries long before the first stone of Mecca was laid upon the sand. "In these books," Ascaf whispered, leaning closer to the old man, "a prophecy is written. Among the descendants of Ishmael, son of Abraham, the final messenger must appear. one who will turn the world upside down. His features are described with the precision of a jeweler, determining the authenticity of a precious stone. The shape of his face, the color of his eyes, special marks on his body, and his birthplace, this very city, Mecca, where trade caravans intersect with ancient sanctuaries. Abd al-Muttalib listened, and his wrinkled face remained impenetrable as a desert rock. He had heard such stories before. Travelers, mystics, astrologers, they all came to Mecca with predictions and visions. But something in this monk's words made the old chieftain tense. At that moment, a boy approached them. Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, walked unhurriedly, his bare feet stepping soundlessly on the scorching stones. The 7-year-old child moved with that special grace that reveals in a person something more than mere good upbringing. The monk froze. His breathing quickened. Askaf's gaze darted from the boy's face to his hands, then to his feet, then slid across his back, as if he were checking against an invisible list. The Christian's fingers trembled as he peered at the child's features. Seconds stretched like hours. The air between the three figures thickened to the limit. "It is him," Askaf finally breathed out, and in his voice sounded terror mixed with reverence. Abd al-Muttalib showed no surprise. He called the boy his son, as was customary among Arabs to call grandsons. But the monk objected, pointing out that the scriptures said the prophet would be an orphan. Only then did the old man admit that this was his grandson, whose father had died before his birth. "You speak the truth," Askaf whispered, and his face paled beneath the tan of road dust. When the monk left, dissolving into the crowd of pilgrims and merchants, Abd al-Muttalib gathered his sons. "Guard your nephew," he told them, and there was no usual softness in his voice. This was an order. You heard what they say about him. From that day, fear settled in the heart of the old chieftain. Not fear for himself. At 90 years old, he had long ceased to fear death. But fear for the boy. Because if Christian monks knew of the prophecy, then others knew too. Jews from Yathrib, pagan priests, those who might see in a 7-year-old child a threat to their power and their gods. Ayman, the servant who looked after Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, later recounted how she once lost sight of the boy. She was distracted for just a few minutes, and when she came to her senses, the child was nowhere to be found. Panic gripped her throat. Mecca was a city where children disappeared forever, kidnapped by slave traders, lost in the labyrinth of narrow streets, or simply trampled in the crush of the marketplace. She rushed about searching until Abd al-Muttalib appeared before her. His face was darker than a storm cloud. "I found him by the lotus tree with other boys," he said, and his voice sounded like the crack of a whip. "See that you don't lose sight of him again. The people of the book claim he will be the prophet of this community, and I do not trust them." He pronounced the last words with special emphasis. Do not trust, meaning fear they might harm him. Thus the old Arab, who once worshipped the idols of the Kaaba, became the bodyguard of a child who would one day destroy all those idols to their foundations. An irony of fate that neither of them yet suspected. Chapter 3. The Footprint That Time Could Not Erase. Abd al-Muttalib stood before the Kaaba at the hour when stars began to emerge through the violet sky of Mecca. Around him stood 360 idols, stone gods he had worshipped all his long life. Hubal with his arrogant visage, Al-Lat, whose name was whispered by women in labor, Al-Uzza, who demanded the blood of sacrificial animals, Manat, by whom men swore before long journeys. But that night, looking at these stone effigies, the old man felt what could only be called revulsion. He was already past 90. Gray hair covered his head like a shroud. The skin on his hands had become thin as the parchment of ancient scrolls. Death breathed down his neck, and he knew it. And it was precisely the nearness of the end that forced him to ask himself the question he had avoided all his life. What did he truly believe in? These stones? these mute effigies that people themselves carve from rocks and themselves endowed with names? He had seen how they were created, seen how craftsmen argued about the shape of a deity's nose, how they haggled over the price for their work. What kind of divinity is it if it can be bought for a handful of dirhams? Number. Deep in his soul, Abd al-Muttalib had always remembered something else. Stories passed down from generation to generation about how his distant ancestor Ibrahim smashed idols and proclaimed one God, about how Ishmael helped his father build the first house of worship on this very spot, not for 300 gods, but for one. And now, watching his grandson, the old man began to change. He stopped drinking khamr, though wine flowed like a river at Quraysh feasts. He forbade himself what others considered pleasure. He began to follow strange rules that seemed to his contemporaries the eccentricities of an old man. He refused to marry close blood relatives, though this was common practice. He ordered the hands of thieves in his clan to be cut off, regardless of their status. He forbade people of his lineage to kill newborn girls, a barbaric custom in which other tribes took pride. The Quraysh looked at him with bewilderment. What had happened to their chieftain? Why was a man who had lived nearly a century by the laws of the desert suddenly beginning to break them? But Abd al-Muttalib did not explain. He simply looked at the boy and saw what others did not see. One day, people from the Banu Mudlij tribe came to him. These wanderers possessed a rare gift. They could determine from footprints what lineage a person belonged to, who their ancestors were, what blood flowed in their veins. A mystical knowledge passed down among them for centuries. They looked at the footprints of Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, left in the wet sand after a rare rain. Then they raised their heads and looked at Abd al-Muttalib as if they had seen a ghost. "Guard this boy," the eldest of them said, and his voice trembled. "This child's footprint, it is the same as the one imprinted in the stone of Maqam Ibrahim." The old man knew what they meant. A few steps from the Kaaba lay a stone on which a footprint was preserved. Legend said it was the trace of Prophet Ibrahim, left thousands of years ago when he built the sanctuary. A trace that time had not erased. A trace that was more than just an indentation in stone. It was testimony. And now these people were saying that the footprint of a 7-year-old boy matched that ancient impression. That night, Abd al-Muttalib could not sleep. He lay on his bed, and beside him Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, dozed peacefully. The boy slept calmly, as only those sleep who know nothing of the burden placed upon them by fate. The old man reached out and touched the child's foot. Small, warm, soft. An ordinary foot of an ordinary child. But Abd al-Muttalib no longer believed in coincidences. Monks saw a prophet in him. Mystics recognized in his footprints the seal of Ibrahim. The old man himself felt how barakah, blessing, emanated from the boy. When Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, sat at the table with other children, there was enough food for everyone, though before the portions barely sufficed for half. When he drank first from a cup of milk, the other children were satisfied with that one cup, though usually 3 were required. Miracles. Small, imperceptible to outsiders, but absolutely real for those who lived near the child. And the old chieftain, who had worshipped stones all his life, began to worship the one who created stones and people and prophets. He did not live to see the day when Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, would receive the first revelation. But 2 decades before that moment, Abd al-Muttalib had already made his decision. Monotheism, Tawheed, the faith of the forefathers, which their descendants had perverted. He returned to it not from fear of death. He returned to it because he held by the hand living proof that God is real, and his plan was unfolding right here in dusty Mecca, in the house of an old sinner. Chapter 4. When Mecca wept for 7 days. Abd al-Muttalib felt the approach of the end. The body that had served him for 95 years began to fail. Hands that had held a sword in countless skirmishes now trembled lifting a cup of water. Legs that had traversed caravan routes from Yemen to Syria could barely carry him from bed to the threshold of his house. Breathing became a struggle. Each breath was a small victory over the encroaching darkness. But the old man did not fear death. He feared what would happen after it. Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, had just turned 8 years old. 8. An age when a boy still needs protection, when he needs a mentor, when he needs someone to shield him from the cruelty of the world. And the world was cruel, especially to orphans, especially to those orphans about whom monks and soothsayers whispered. Abd al-Muttalib lay on his deathbed and summoned his sons, all 10 of them. They came and stood around him, their faces stern but their eyes filled with grief. This was the man who had made their clan the most respected in Mecca, the man whose word was law, whose name opened any door. His gaze slid across their faces and stopped on one. Abu Talib, not the eldest of his sons, not the wealthiest, not even the strongest, but the one in whom the old man saw something special, the same tenderness toward the boy, the same instinctive understanding that this child was no ordinary child. The will was brief. Guard him, protect him, provide for him, love him as your own son. Abu Talib bowed his head in agreement, and tears flowed down his cheeks, leaving tracks on a face covered with desert dust. 2 days later, Abd al-Muttalib closed his eyes for the last time. It happened at dawn, when the sky over Mecca was painted the color of congealed blood. Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, stood by his bed holding his grandfather's cooling hand. The boy did not understand everything that was happening, but he understood the main thing. The person who loved him more than anyone else in the world was going to a place from which there is no return. And then the 8-year-old child wept. Ayman saw those tears and remembered them for the rest of her life. Later she recounted that she never again saw such tears on the face of the messenger of Allah. Tears of grief so deep it seemed bottomless. Tears of a child who had lost his mother at 6, never knew his father, and now lost his grandfather too. Thrice orphaned, thrice abandoned. But Mecca prepared to mourn not the boy, but the old man. What happened next had no precedent in the history of the city. When news of Abd al-Muttalib's death spread through the streets, people began to emerge from their homes. Hundreds, thousands, men, women, elders, children. They walked to the house of the Hashemites with one purpose: to express their grief. The wailing was so great it seemed as though Mecca itself was weeping. Women tore their clothes. Men sprinkled their heads with ashes. Children, not understanding what was happening, cried because their parents cried. Never, the old-timers later said, never had this city seen such universal grief. Even when other great chieftains died, even when they buried war heroes and famous merchants, nothing compared to this day. The funeral bier was carried from the house and the procession began. In front walked the Quraysh elders, behind them the sons of the deceased, and following them, a small, fragile figure among the crowd of grown men, walked 8-year-old Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace. His face was pale. The tears had dried on his cheeks, leaving salty traces. He walked steadily, without stumbling, though the road to the burial place was rocky and difficult. People parted before the procession, and many of them looked not at the bier with the body of the great chieftain, but at this boy, at the grandson who had lost his last protector. The markets of Mecca closed that day, and remained closed for many days after. Merchants refused to sell. Caravans stood outside the city walls, not entering. This was not merely a tribute of respect. This was recognition that something important had ended. An era had concluded. The man who had been a living bridge between the old world and something new was gone. And the boy he had so carefully guarded remained alone. Alone in a city where orphans were the most defenseless creatures. Alone among people who were already beginning to forget the departed old man's instructions. alone before the face of a destiny that was preparing trials for him of which the 8-year-old child could not even guess. When Abd al-Muttalib's body was lowered into the earth and the last handful of sand lay upon his grave, Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, turned and slowly walked away. Beside him walked his new guardian, Abu Talib, who placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. But they both knew nothing would replace the one who now lay beneath the earth, the one who had seen in an orphaned infant a future prophet and devoted the last years of his life to preserving that sacred flame. Chapter 5. The Cup of Milk That Fed Everyone. Abu Talib's house was poor. Poverty had eaten into its walls as deeply as desert sand ate into the skin of travelers. This man's real name was Abdu Manaf, but everyone called him Abu Talib, father of Talib, after his eldest son. He had a wife, 4 children of his own, and now an orphaned nephew. There was barely enough food. There were days when the entire family was brought one bowl of lentil soup, diluted with water to transparency. There were nights when the children went to bed with growling stomachs, and Abu Talib sat at the threshold gazing at the stars, asking himself how he would feed all these mouths. He was not a failure. Fortune simply passed him by. Caravans in which he invested were robbed by bandits. Goods he bought cheap somehow failed to sell dear. Money slipped through his fingers like water through a sieve. Yet he was from the noble Hashim clan, nephew of the great Abd al-Muttalib. But nobility did not warm on cold nights and did not fill empty stomachs. And into this house of need came an 8-year-old boy. Abu Talib accepted him not from pity and not from a sense of duty. He accepted him because he loved him. The same inexplicable love his grandfather had felt for him now lived in his uncle's heart. When Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, entered a room, something changed in the air. It became easier to breathe. The weight of poverty seemed less crushing, but it was at the dinner table that things began to happen that defied explanation. When Abu Talib's own children sat down to eat, they fell upon the food like hungry dogs, jostling with elbows, grabbing pieces with their hands, each pulling toward himself, trying to snatch more, because tomorrow there might be nothing. This was the law of poverty: take while they're giving, eat while there is food. Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, would sit nearby and not extend his hand. He simply sat, watched as others ate, waited. His thin hands lay on his knees, and he did not move until the others were satisfied. Modesty, good manners, respect, qualities that do not exist in children his age, especially hungry children. Ayman, who continued to look after the boy, swore later that never, never did she hear him complain. Not once did he say he was hungry. Not once did he ask for water when he was thirsty. In the morning he might drink Zamzam, sacred water from the well by the Kaaba, and this would suffice him until evening. When he was offered food at noon, he would refuse. "I am satisfied," he would say, and his eyes did not lie. How can a child be satisfied who has drunk only water? But Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, was satisfied. His face was not gaunt. His cheeks had not sunken. He grew healthy, strong, though he ate less than a growing body required. And then began what made Abu Talib look at his nephew with superstitious fear. When the children ate without Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, there was not enough food. The bowl would empty, and half the children remained hungry. Quarrels, tears, resentments, the usual picture in a poorhouse. But when Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, sat at the table, a miracle occurred. The same bowl, the same amount of soup or flatbread, but everyone was satisfied. Each child rose from the table full, bellies filled, hunger retreated. Abu Talib looked at the empty bowl and could not understand how this was possible. The laws of arithmetic did not work in the presence of this boy. "Do not begin without my son," Abu Talib began to say when food was brought. "Wait until he comes." And the children waited, because they knew if they began without him, they would remain hungry. But if they waited, they would be satisfied. One day they brought a single cup of milk. Milk was a luxury in their house, a rare, precious luxury. Usually such a cup was enough for two, at most three children, and only if they drank in small sips. Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, drank first. His lips touched the edge of the cup. He took a small sip and passed it to the next child. One after another, the children drank from this cup. They drank long, greedily, to complete satisfaction. The last child finished the remainder and placed the cup on the floor. Everyone was satisfied, from one cup of milk. Abu Talib sat and looked at the empty cup, and a chill ran down his spine. This was not mere luck. This was something greater. Barakah, blessing. That invisible presence of divine mercy that transformed the small into the sufficient, the scarce into the abundant. Abu Talib's poor house became a house of miracles. Small, quiet, imperceptible to outsiders, but absolutely real for those who lived under this roof. The children stopped quarreling over food. Abu Talib's wife stopped crying at night, counting the remaining crumbs. Abu Talib himself began to sleep more peacefully, knowing that somehow, in an incomprehensible way, they would survive. All because of the presence of one boy. Neighbors began to whisper, "What is happening in Abu Talib's house? Why do his children look well-fed, though he is still poor? Where does this strange fortune come from that does not make him rich, but does not let him die of hunger?" Some spoke of sorcery. Others recalled the words of monks and soothsayers about the boy from the Hashim clan. But Abu Talib explained nothing. He simply laid Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, to sleep beside him every evening. He would lie on his side and watch the boy fall asleep, and he would think of his father Abd al-Muttalib's words, "Guard him, something great awaits this boy." Now Abu Talib understood these words more deeply. Greatness was already here. It lived in this 8-year-old body. It manifested not in loud miracles but in quiet ones, in the feeding of the hungry, in the multiplication of the small, in that peace that descended upon the house with the child's presence. And the uncle loved his nephew even more fiercely, with a love that was more than mere family affection. This was reverence before a mystery he could not fathom, but felt with every cell of his body. Chapter 6. The man who gave everything except one word. Years passed. The boy became a youth. The youth became a man. Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, turned 40 when he came to Abu Talib with incredible news. In a cave on Mount Hira, an angel had appeared to him, Jibril, the archangel Gabriel of whom Jews and Christians spoke. And this angel transmitted the first words of revelation that would turn the world upside down. Abu Talib listened. His nephew, whom he had raised as his own son, now stood before him declaring himself a messenger of God, the final prophet, the very one about whom monks had whispered 33 years ago by the walls of the Kaaba. And the uncle believed him, not in the sense that he accepted the faith, no, but he believed that Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, spoke the truth, that he was not a liar, not a madman, that what he recounted had truly happened to him. Mecca exploded with fury. The Quraysh, proud aristocrats of the desert, could not allow anyone to encroach upon their gods. 360 idols of the Kaaba brought them power, money, prestige. Pilgrims from all of Arabia came to worship these stones, and each pilgrim left coins in the pockets of Mecca's merchants. And now this man Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, called for destroying it all, declaring the idols false, proclaiming one God. They began to persecute him, insulted him in the streets, threw stones, dumped garbage on his head when he prayed, beat his followers, tortured slaves who had accepted the new faith. Mecca became hell for those who dared to say, "There is no God but Allah." And then Abu Talib rose. The old man, already past 70, emerged onto the square before the Kaaba and declared to the Quraysh, "Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, is under his protection. Whoever touches him declares war on the entire Hashemite clan." His voice, weakened by age, nevertheless sounded like the strike of a sword against a shield. This was a challenge. This was a line that could not be crossed. The Quraysh stopped. Because Abu Talib was not merely an old man. He was the head of one of the most influential clans. Behind him stood warriors. Blood vengeance in Arabia was sacred law, and if the Hashemites declared war, Mecca would drown in blood. But the enemies did not surrender. They came to Abu Talib with an offer. "Give us Muhammad," they said, "and in return we will give you the most handsome, smartest, most talented youth from our clans. He will be like a son to you. You will lose nothing." Abu Talib looked at them so fiercely they recoiled. "You propose that I give my son to death, and in exchange take your son so I might raise him for you? Do you think me so foolish?" They left, but returned again, with threats, with curses, with promises to make the life of the Hashim clan unbearable. And finally the Quraysh declared a boycott, a complete economic blockade. No one had the right to trade with the Hashemites. No one could sell them food. No one could marry their daughters or give their daughters to them in marriage. The clan was isolated like lepers. 3 years this blockade lasted. 3 years of hunger, deprivation, deaths. Children died of starvation. Women lost their minds from grief. The groans of the starving echoed through the valley of Abu Talib, where the Hashemites were driven. Sometimes at night, someone sympathetic would secretly bring them food, risking their own life. But it was catastrophically insufficient. Abu Talib saw how his tribespeople died, saw the emaciated faces of children, heard the wailing of mothers over the bodies of infants they could not feed. All this happened because of one man, because of his nephew, because of Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, who refused to renounce his preaching. Any other would have handed the rebel over to his enemies. Any other would have chosen the life of his clan. But not Abu Talib. He stood like a rock, and his protection did not waver for a moment. When the blockade finally ended, shadows of people emerged from the valley, emaciated, sick, broken, but undefeated. Abu Talib led them, leaning on a staff, barely dragging his legs. The old man's body was worn by the sufferings of recent years, but he was alive. And Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, was alive beside him. Very little time passed, and Abu Talib took to his bed. The illness that had been growing in him during the blockade now bloomed as a deadly flower. He lay on his bed, and breathing came to him with difficulty. Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, sat at his bedside holding his uncle's hand, the very hand that had stroked his head when he was an 8-year-old orphan, the very hand that had risen in his defense before all of Mecca. "Say it, Muhammad. May Allah bless him and grant him peace," whispered. "Say just one phrase. There is no God but Allah. One phrase, uncle, so that I may intercede for you before the Lord." But Abu Talib's lips would not open for these words. He had seen miracles. He had seen how the small became abundant. He had seen signs on the infant's body matching ancient prophecies. He had heard monks and soothsayers. He had defended the prophet at the cost of his tribespeople's lives. He had loved this man more than his own sons, but he did not utter the words of faith. Why? Fear of the ancestors' mockery? The pride of a man who had walked his own path all his life. An invisible veil upon the heart that even miracles could not pierce. History gives no answer. It only records the fact. Abu Talib died without accepting Islam. Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, emerged from the dying man's room with a face distorted by grief. He had lost not merely an uncle. He had lost the man who had been a father to him, a protector, the only one who stood between him and Mecca's fury. And now this man was departing to the other world without taking with him the one thing that could save him in eternity. A few days later, Khadijah died, the wife of the Prophet, may Allah bless him and grant him peace. The woman who had first believed in him, who had supported him with her wealth, her wisdom, her love. 2 deaths in 1 year, the year of sorrow, they later called it, the year when Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, lost everything. And at that moment the Quraysh understood that the road was open. Abu Talib was no more. Protection was no more. Now they could kill the Prophet, and no one would declare blood vengeance. Thus began the most terrible days of persecution. Thus began the hunt that would end only with migration to Medina. Thus fate turned to Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, its cruel side. And somewhere in a grave beneath the scorching sand of Mecca lay a man who could have become one of the greatest companions of the Prophet, but chose to remain on the threshold of faith without crossing it. A man who gave everything for his nephew, but did not give the most important thing, his acknowledgement of the truth his nephew preached. The story of al-Muttalib and Abu Talib is a story about how even miracles do not guarantee faith, that one can see signs and not read them, that one can love a prophet and not accept his message, that one can sacrifice life itself to defend truth and still not let that truth into one's own heart. The grandfather believed at the end of his life, renouncing idols. The uncle defended the faith to his last breath, but never entered it himself. 2 men, 2 destinies, one question to which there is no answer. Why does one heart open to what remains closed to another, even if both saw the same thing? Mecca did not know the answer then. We do not know it now.